When my son-in-law's law firm called me on the morning of my wife's funeral and said, I found something in her office. Come see it before you go to the burial. I nearly dropped the phone right there in the church parking lot. Then he added, Don't tell your daughter. Not yet. You could be in danger. If you're new here, stick around, because this one gets darker than you'd expect. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from today. Hit that like button before we start. And if you haven't subscribed, now's the time, because trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a union electrician out of Local 26 in Columbus, Ohio, and I was married to my wife, Carol, for 36 years. This is her story more than mine. I just happened to be the one who lived to tell it. The funeral was on a Thursday, the second week of October, at Shoreline Funeral Home on Sullivan Avenue. The sky that morning was the flat gray kind, no wind, no rain, just heavy and still, like the whole city was holding its breath along with me. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to my daughter's wedding 12 years earlier, and I stood in front of a casket holding the only woman I had ever really loved, waiting for the moment to feel real. It didn't. Not standing there. Not yet. Carol had died 11 days before that morning, 61 years old. The doctors at Mount Carmel called it a stroke, sudden, they said, brought on by a blood pressure spike they hadn't seen coming, especially given how well she'd always taken care of herself. I believed them, because back then I had no reason not to. My wife had spent 19 years as the office manager for a small but well-regarded estate law firm, Whitfield and Cross, run by a man named Thomas Whitfield. She loved that job more than she ever let on. She used to say Thomas trusted her with more than he trusted most of his own partners. And now, looking back, I understand exactly how true that turned out to be. About 50 people came to the service that day. Neighbors from our street, two of Carol's sisters, a handful of women from her book club who cried harder than I did. My daughter, Melissa, sat in the front row beside her husband, Dean, and I remember noticing, even through my own fog of grief, that Dean never once looked up from his phone during the eulogy. Melissa kept her hand on his knee the whole service, like she was holding him in place, and every few minutes he'd lean toward her and murmur something short, low, urgent, nothing like a grieving son-in-law comforting his wife. It looked more like two people managing a problem. At 11:40 that morning, right as the pastor was closing the service, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name lighting up the screen. Thomas Whitfield. I slipped out into the hallway, my pulse already climbing, and when I answered, his voice came through tight and clipped in a way I had never once heard from that man in 15 years of knowing him. Walter, he said, I need you to come to the office. Right now, before you go to the cemetery. Thomas, what is this? I said, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't carry back through the door. I'm at Carol's funeral. I know exactly where you are, he said. That's why I'm calling now instead of waiting. I found something in her desk this morning, and Walter, I need you to see it in person. Don't stop at home first. And whatever you do, don't say a word about this call to Melissa or Dean. Not yet. You could be in real danger. To understand why those words hit me the way they did, you have to understand who Thomas Whitfield was. This was not a man who rattled easily. I'd known him for over a decade, through company holiday parties and Carol's work events. And every single time he was measured, careful, the kind of man who'd spent 30 years reading contracts for a living and never once raised his voice doing it. Hearing him sound frightened told me, before he said another word, that whatever he'd found was bad. I need to back up and explain something about my family, because none of what happened next will make sense otherwise. Carol and I built a comfortable, ordinary life. I made good money in the union, she made steady money at the firm, and together we'd paid off our house on Kenwood Drive years ago, built up a modest retirement account, and helped our daughter and her husband more times than I can count. Melissa was 34, married to Dean for 8 years, and the two of them had been drowning in debt since Dean's contracting business collapsed during the pandemic. They'd been leaning on us harder over the past year than they ever had before. Sunday dinners had turned into Wednesday drop-ins, which had turned into Dean offering, out of nowhere, to help Carol simplify some of the financial paperwork since things get complicated as you get older. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. Neither had Carol. Looking back now, that's exactly the mistake we made. In the weeks before she died, something had shifted in Carol that I didn't pay close enough attention to. She started getting winded walking up our porch steps. She said her chest felt tight some mornings, said she felt dizzy if she stood up too fast, and her doctor bumped her blood pressure medication up twice, trying to get ahead of it. Dean had started stopping by on Mondays and Thursdays, always with the same excuse, to help her get the online banking sorted out, since she'd never been comfortable with computers. One Thursday in September, I came home from a job early and found Dean alone at our kitchen table, with Carol's laptop open in front of him, and Carol asleep on the living room sofa in the middle of the afternoon, which she never did, not once, in 36 years. Dean looked up, smiled, said Carol had gotten tired, helping him look something up, and dozed off, and he left 15 minutes later. I didn't think a thing of it. My wife trusted her son-in-law. I trusted my wife. 4 days before she died, Carol asked me if I remembered signing something with her back in June, a form about updating our beneficiary designations on the retirement accounts, in case anything ever happened to either of us. I told her I had no memory of signing anything like that. She frowned and said Dean had mentioned bringing some paperwork by for us to look over, and she must have simply forgotten doing it. We let it go. We had no reason not to. The morning she collapsed, a Sunday, I was at the hardware store on Sullivant, picking up a part for the garage door. Carol called Melissa first because I didn't have my phone on me, and by the time I got home 19 minutes later, the paramedics already had her on a gurney, loading her into the ambulance. She never regained consciousness. Stroke, they told me at the hospital. Sudden, unexpected. Nobody asked a single follow-up question, and in my grief, neither did I. Standing in that hallway outside the funeral service, with Thomas's voice shaking in my ear, all of it came rushing back at once. The laptop on the kitchen table, the beneficiary form I never signed, the way Dean and Melissa had been hovering around Carol for months, like they were waiting on something to finish. Thomas, just tell me, I said. What did you find? Not over the phone. Come to the office, Walter, and listen to me carefully. Don't tell Melissa. Don't tell Dean. Not until I've shown you everything. My hands were shaking by the time I hung up. I walked back into the service, sat through the final few minutes without absorbing a single word, and when the pastor finished and everyone began filing out toward the burial site, I told Melissa I had some paperwork from Carol's insurance company that couldn't wait, and that I'd meet everyone back at the house for the gathering afterward. Melissa barely glanced up. Okay, Dad. Whatever you need to do. Dean didn't look at me at all. He was already walking toward the parking lot ahead of her, phone pressed to his ear, talking low to someone I couldn't see, his stride quick and purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with grief. I stood there for a moment, watching my son-in-law hurry away from his mother-in-law's own funeral, and that cold feeling from the hallway sank deeper into my chest. I got into my truck, an old gray Silverado with the paint fading on the hood, and drove downtown toward the Whitfield and Cross offices on Broad Street with my wife's casket not yet even lowered into the ground behind me, and no idea that the worst part of that day hadn't happened yet. Whitfield and Cross occupied the 4th floor of a brick office building downtown, the kind of building Carol used to point out proudly whenever we drove past it on our way to dinner. I parked in the small visitor lot at 12:20, still in my funeral suit, my tie loosened, my mind racing through every possibility of what Thomas could need to show me. I walked through the lobby, past a security guard named Ray, who waved me through because he recognized me from the firm's Christmas parties over the years, and I headed for the stairwell instead of the elevator, too restless to wait. That's when I saw a car swerve into the loading zone just outside the glass entrance behind me. Too fast, angled badly, half in a spot that wasn't a spot. Dean's black Chevy Malibu. I stopped cold. My son-in-law was supposed to be standing at the burial site right now, greeting neighbors, holding my daughter's hand while they lowered her mother's casket. Instead, here he was, downtown at his mother-in-law's law firm, less than 20 minutes after telling me nothing, having said not one word about coming here himself. I stepped behind a support column near the stairwell entrance, my heart slamming against my ribs, and watched through the glass as Dean got out of his car and half-jogged toward the doors, straightening his jacket, his face tight and pale in a way I had never seen on him. He didn't look like a grieving son-in-law. He looked like a man racing a clock. I stayed frozen behind that column for what felt like a full minute, watching Dean walk straight up to the reception desk, not toward the elevators, the front desk, and start talking fast and low to the young receptionist there. I couldn't make out the words, but I could read every line of his body, leaning in, one hand flat on the counter, the posture of a man trying to talk his way past a locked door. She shook her head slowly. He said something else, more forceful this time, and she picked up the phone, clearly calling upstairs to check with someone. I used that window to slip past them both and take the stairs, my funeral suit blending in just enough that Dean never turned around, and I climbed to the fourth floor with my pulse pounding in my ears. Thomas was standing right outside the stairwell door when I opened it, his face pale, tie loosened, like he'd been pacing the hallway waiting for me. "Walter, thank God," he said, and before I could get a single word out, "Did you see him downstairs?" "That's my son-in-law," I said. "Thomas, tell me what is going on. Why is Dean here?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Because I called your home line by mistake this morning, before I had your cell number pulled up, and Melissa answered. I only told her I needed to speak with you about paperwork Carol had left with me. I didn't say what, but apparently that was enough to send Dean running down here to get ahead of you." My stomach dropped straight through the floor. Get ahead of me on what? Thomas led me down the hallway toward his office, and without turning around, he said the words that changed everything. "Your wife knew something was happening to her, Walter. And she made absolutely certain that I'd be the one to tell you, not them." Thomas's office looked exactly as I remembered it from the one holiday party Carol had dragged me to years back. Dark wood shelving, a view over the downtown rooftops, a desk far too large for one man. He shut the door behind us and locked it, then walked over to a small wall safe hidden behind a framed print of the Ohio State House. He pulled out a plain white envelope, Carol's handwriting across the front. "For Walter only, if anything happens to me." "She brought this to me 3 weeks ago," Thomas said, sitting down in the chair across from me instead of behind his desk, which told me something about how seriously he meant to treat what came next. "She said she didn't trust keeping it at home. Said if anything happened to her, I was to give it to you, only you, in person, and to warn you to be careful who you told." My hands shook opening it. Inside was a folded letter in Carol's handwriting and a small USB drive taped to the back of it. I read the letter standing right there in his office. She wrote that she'd noticed money disappearing from our joint retirement account. Small withdrawals at first, then larger ones, spread out over roughly 5 months. She wrote that she'd asked Dean about a form she didn't remember signing, and he'd waved it off. But something about the look on his face when she pushed had stayed with her. She started quietly pulling bank statements herself, using an old login from years back when she'd managed our household finances. She wrote that she'd found a beneficiary change filed with the bank in June with both our signatures on it, except she was certain she hadn't signed it, and just as certain I hadn't either. She wrote that she'd started feeling strange around the same time Dean began coming by to help with the accounts, and that she didn't want to believe what she was starting to suspect, but she wasn't willing to stay silent about it either. "There's more on the drive," Thomas said quietly. "Financial records. Messages. Walter, I think you should sit down for this." Thomas plugged the drive into his laptop and turned the screen toward me. The first folder held bank statements Carol had screenshotted herself. 3 separate transfers out of our retirement account between May and September, totaling just under $54,000, all authorized using that beneficiary form neither of us had signed. The money had landed in an account under Melissa and Dean's names. The second folder held photographs Carol had taken of her pharmacy receipts laid beside her pill bottles, with notes in her own handwriting comparing what she'd been prescribed against what she'd actually been given. She'd written that the count never quite matched, that there always seemed to be a few extra pills mixed into her organizer, small and white, that she didn't recognize from her regular blood pressure prescription. The third folder was the one that put ice straight through my chest. A screenshot of a text conversation Carol had found on the shared family tablet we kept in the kitchen for grocery lists and photos. A conversation between Dean and someone saved only as Roy, dated about a month before she died. Dean had written, "She's asking questions about the account again. We need to close this out before she talks to Walter." The reply from Roy read, "Just keep bumping the dosage a little at a time. Nobody looks twice at a stroke at her age." I sat completely still, staring at that screen, feeling something crack open in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Thomas put a hand on my shoulder and told me my wife had come to him specifically because she was afraid that if anything happened to her, whoever was responsible would get to me first and control the story before I ever learned the truth. She'd made sure that couldn't happen. "She protected you from beyond the grave, Walter," Thomas said quietly. "Now, it's our turn to protect you for real." I asked him why he'd warned me to keep Melissa and Dean away from this. He answered plainly, "If Carol's suspicions were right, and everything on that drive said they very likely were, then Dean was capable of far more than moving money around. And if he found out this drive existed, I could be next in line. especially with a forged beneficiary form already sitting on file that would hand him and Melissa control over everything Carol and I had built. We need proof strong enough for the police, Thomas said, not just suspicion, and we need it before they realize we're looking. That same afternoon, Thomas called an old contact of his, a retired Columbus police detective turned private investigator named Sam Kowalski. Sam met us at the office within the hour, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with careful eyes and a habit of listening like every word you said mattered. He went through the contents of that drive twice without saying much, then finally said the thing none of us wanted to hear out loud. "This is enough to open something," Sam said. "But it's not enough on its own to guarantee a conviction. We need the pharmacy's fill records pulled through proper channels. We need a forensic look at that signature on the beneficiary form. And honestly, Walter, if you're willing, a couple of cameras in your house for a while would give us everything else we need, because people like this, sooner or later, they talk when they think no one's listening." I sat there in that office, my wife not even 2 weeks in the ground. Being asked by two men I barely knew to walk back into my own home and act like nothing had changed while my daughter and her husband believed they'd gotten away with murder. It was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of me. I said yes without hesitating, because Carol had trusted me with the truth, and I wasn't going to waste it. Sam installed 2 small cameras in the house 2 nights later, one built into a smoke detector in the kitchen, one tucked inside an old mantel clock in the living room. While Dean and Melissa believed I was staying with my brother in Dayton to get some space, I moved back home that following Monday and told everyone I just needed to be around Carol's things for a while. It took 14 days. 14 days of forcing myself to sit at the dinner table with my daughter and her husband, nodding along while they talked about helping settle Mom's affairs, listening to Dean gently bring up the house on Kenwood Drive twice, asking when I thought I might be ready to think about downsizing. Every night I went to bed sick to my stomach, and every morning I got up and did it again. Because Sam had warned me that the second they felt completely safe was the second they'd stop being careful. On the 15th day, it happened. Melissa and Dean came by for dinner, and after I excused myself upstairs early, claiming exhaustion, the kitchen camera caught them alone at the table, voices low but perfectly clear. Melissa said, word for word, "The account's fully moved over. Once Dad signs off on selling the house, we're completely clear. We don't even need the beneficiary form anymore." Dean answered, "Just don't get careless like you did with your mom." That pharmacist almost caught the refill timing. Melissa laughed, an actual laugh, and said, "Nobody double checks an old woman's blood pressure pills, Dean. Nobody ever does." Sam had that footage locked into an evidence file within the hour. Combined with the pharmacy's fill records showing an unexplained early refill pattern on a medication that can dangerously spike blood pressure at high doses, and a forensic handwriting comparison confirming the beneficiary form had been forged, Sam told me flatly that we finally had what he called an airtight case. Thomas looked at me across his desk that night and said quietly, "Now we bring them out into the open, Walter, on our terms, not theirs." We decided to do it at the reading of Carol's will, which our family attorney, a woman named Rita Alvarez, who had handled our estate paperwork for years, had already scheduled for the following Wednesday at her office downtown. Melissa and Dean had no idea Sam Kowalski would be sitting quietly in the conference room next door, or that 2 Columbus police detectives would be parked outside in an unmarked car waiting on his signal. I spent that week playing the part exactly as I had for the 2 weeks before, tired, quiet, cooperative, letting Melissa believe everything was going exactly according to plan. She even hugged me the morning of the meeting and told me she was proud of how strong I'd been through all of this. I stood there and let her arms wrap around me, thinking about that text message on Thomas's laptop, feeling nothing but a cold, steady patience. We all sat down in Rita's office at 10 that morning. Dean in a charcoal suit, Melissa in black, both of them composed, almost relaxed, clearly expecting a simple formality before collecting what they'd already decided was theirs. Rita went through the standard opening of the reading, then, right on cue, looked at me and asked if there was anything I wanted to say before she continued. "Actually, yes," I said, and I watched Dean's expression shift, just barely, the first crack of unease. "Before we go any further, I think it's time everyone in this room sees what Carol left behind." I nodded toward the door, and Thomas Whitfield walked in carrying his laptop, followed by Sam Kowalski, whose face Dean clearly half recognized from somewhere, maybe an old encounter, maybe just instinct, because the color drained straight out of his face. Melissa's voice came out sharp. "What is this? Dad, what's going on? I looked at her steadily. Your mother is what's going on. Thomas set the laptop on the table and played the kitchen footage without a word of introduction. Melissa's own voice filled that small office, clear as day, talking about the account being fully moved, about not needing the beneficiary form anymore, and then Dean's voice answering back, warning her not to get careless like she had with her mother. The room went completely silent except for that recording, every word of it landing like a hammer blow. Melissa's face went white, then red, and she shot up out of her chair so fast it scraped hard against the floor. That's not what it sounds like. That's taken out of context, Dad. You have to believe me. Sit down, Sam said calmly, showing his credentials for the first time. There are two detectives waiting right outside this office, and everything you say from this point forward can be used against you. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Forgery. And pending toxicology results from an exhumation request already filed with the county coroner regarding Carol Briggs's cause of death. Dean hadn't said a single word yet. He just sat there, staring down at the table, and I watched something collapse in my son-in-law's face. Not innocence, because that had been gone a long time before this morning, but the particular look of a man who finally understands there's nowhere left to run. Walter, he said, voice cracking, I never wanted her to actually die. I swear to God. It was only supposed to slow her down, keep her too confused to fight the paperwork. I felt Thomas's hand land on my shoulder, steady, grounding, because for 1 second the whole room tilted, and all I could see was Carol in that hospital bed I never reached in time. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Your mother-in-law spent 36 years making sure everyone at that table had a full plate before she ever thought about her own, I said quietly, looking at Dean, then at my daughter. And the two of you sat across from her, counting the months until you got the house. The detectives came in 2 minutes later. Melissa cried the entire way out. Dean never said another word. It's been just over 7 months now since that morning in Rita Alvarez's office. Dean pled guilty to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and forgery, and he's currently serving a 5-year sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Melissa's case went further. The exhumation and toxicology report confirmed dangerously elevated levels of a blood pressure medication in Carol's system, far beyond anything any doctor had ever prescribed her. Melissa was convicted of involuntary manslaughter alongside the financial charges. She's looking at 10 years. Roy, it turned out, was an old friend of Dean's from high school who worked behind the counter at a pharmacy across town, quietly diverting extra medication for cash, and he's now facing his own set of charges separate from theirs. I still live in the house on Kenwood Drive. Some mornings the quiet used to feel like a wound. Now, most days, it just feels honest. I got the retirement money back, every last dollar of it, through the court. Though if I'm being honest with you, the money was never really what mattered. Thomas Whitfield and I have become close friends since all of this, something neither of us ever expected walking into it. He tells me Carol used to talk about me at the office more than I ever realized. Always proud, always certain I'd stand up and do right by her if it ever came down to it. I set up a small memorial fund in Carol's name through the Cardiac and Stroke Program at Mount Carmel for families who can't afford the follow-up screenings that might have caught what was happening to her sooner. It's not large yet, but it's growing, and every dollar that goes into it carries her name forward, doing some good in the world, which is exactly the kind of thing she would have wanted. I think about that hallway outside the funeral home more than I probably should. Thomas's voice shaking on the other end of that call, telling me to come see something before it was too late for it to matter. My wife protected me one last time from somewhere I couldn't see her anymore, and I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure that protection meant something. If this story reached you the way I hope it did, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and tell me what you'd have done in my shoes. And subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one, friend.